Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I welcome you to a presentation on V is for Victory, FDR's efforts to prepare the U.S. for war. We also welcome our fellow veterans who are viewing this program from the Edith Norse Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Bob Lewis. Captain Bob Lewis spent 7 years with the U.S. Navy as a patrol plane commander, serving on the aircraft carriers Wasp, Intrepid, and Saratoga. As a Naval Reserve officer, he flew P-2s and P-3s and commanded his Naval Reserve unit. In his 30 years with the MITRE Corporation, he spent 8 years in Germany at headquarters U.S. Army Europe, helping to develop joint communications systems to integrate the Army, Air Force, and Marines. He later returned to Germany to lead the communications engineering effort for an alternate command post in Romania. He's a director of the Lexington Veterans Association and a board member at his community food pantry, library, church, and historical society. Please welcome Bob Lewis.
Here's the situation. United States at the time of the stock market crash of 1929, the resulting Great Depression, the resulting bank panic crisis, the Dust Bowl, and the resulting huge migration of farm families westward from the Dust Bowl region, looking for work in California during the Great Depression, where there weren't very many jobs. Another situation, the lingering isolationist influence of World War I and the ongoing rapid and ferocious conquest of Europe by Nazi Germany. The Great Depression, notice the number of people that this impacted. Some historians kind of agree that overall, in the United States, the unemployment was about 20%. But in some places, such as Lowell, it was up to 90%. Why? Where does this story fit in history? October 29, stock market crash, Great Depression began. 1930, the Dust Bowl, the devastating environmental disaster, which caused the largest migration in the United States. March 33, FDR was inaugurated for first term as president. FDR worked really quickly, almost immediately. Notice April 5, he began the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Great Depression, the stock market crash of 29 caused a complete loss of consumer confidence in future income. So people tightened their belts and said, well, I'm not going to buy a new car. I'm not going to buy a new refrigerator. I'm going to save my money because I'm not sure if I'll have a job tomorrow. So consumer confidence and business spending and basically dried up. So consumers and firms put off purchases of durable goods such as automobiles. And of course, the people who made automobiles, people who made durable goods, refrigerators, toys, they put up such purchases. So the people that made those things, the automobiles and the durable goods, they quit making them. They had to let their workers go. So it's tremendous unemployment. Another factor here, other than just the loss of consumer confidence, was the high interest rates. The Federal Reserve was trying to stop people from speculating on stocks because of the stock market crash. They didn't want that speculation anymore. Speculation was extreme. The banks where you put your money, they were speculating on the stock market. And of course, when they lost because of the crash, suddenly your money was no longer in the bank. So the federal government raised interest rates. to get people out of the stock market and into bonds and other saving implements. So high interest rates, as you know today, they basically defeat the loan industry because people don't want to buy a new car now because they have to pay a lot of interest. They don't want to construct a new home because the mortgage rate interest is, again, real high. So intentional high interest rates made loans expensive. So in the United States in 1929, the Great Depression began and spread worldwide, became the longest, most severe economic downturn in modern history. The second was in 2007. Again, people borrowing money that they couldn't pay back. That was essentially a subprime mortgage system failure in 2007. But that was the second highest. And the unemployment during that period went up only to 4.5% in the United States, compared to 20% back in 1929. So, but I mentioned this, 90% of all Massachusetts folks were unemployed because the products they were making were no longer being purchased. Decline in spending, decline in aggregate demand. FDR saw that there were about 14 million young, employable, healthy young men on the relief rolls. He wanted to save those young men, but he also wanted to save the forests. And he was a real conservationist. He's extremely interested personally in forests and trees. So he established the Civilian Conservation Corps early, April 5, 1933, moved very quickly. The CCC was part of the New Deal legislation, combating high unemployment during the Great Depression. Military appropriation was not part of the mission of the CCC, but I think you'll see that maybe in fact had tremendous benefits later when we needed trained soldiers. So what was the role of the Army in this? The War Department, because they were the only organization in the government that could take in large numbers of young men, house them, train them, feed them. So the War Department, through the Army, supervised all phases of camp operation. This includes the enrolling of all men, the purchase and supply of clothing, buying and preparation of food, providing medical and hospital care for enrollees, and maintaining sanitary conditions within the camps. The Army also builds the camps. The Army is in charge of camp discipline, education, recreation, and compiles and maintains statistics and the records of the CC men and the camp administration. They also were the CCC paymaster. So they sent the allotment checks back to the families of the enrollees each month and paid the enrollees in cash. There were 3 to 5 applicants for every CC position. This was really a real hit. The young men liked it because they got paid $30 a month. 25, they got sent home to their family, help their family. They got $5. They got room and board. They got lots of good hard physical labor. And you can see the discipline. It looks very much like the Army, doesn't it? Here's a morning roll call, a flag ceremony. So there's lots of basically discipline that really worked out well. Now, all camps were administered by reserve officers of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, or warrant officers of the Coast Guard. So think about how much experience these officers got of running a camp, working with young men, disciplining them, training them, getting them up, and getting them on to trucks and get to work. Then, in the morning, they were turned over to a superintendent of the local forest to go to work. Now, notice this song. This is a song and a poem. It's great to have a mess kit when you haven't got a dime. So when you're really hungry, it's really great to be fed. And there's some guys at a CC camp lining up, getting along with everybody, eating food that mom didn't cook. And loving it. It was hard physical labor. The average enrollee in the first 6 months, because of the good food plus the hard physical labor, the average enrollee gained 14 pounds of muscle the first 6 months. Yeah. So it's good for the Army because the officers got trained in how to run a camp and how to train them, how to teach them hygiene. They learned other things too. For first aid, for example, very useful for a soldier. Hard physical labor, but plenty of food. Here they are planting trees in a burned out forest. The CCC planted over 1 billion trees. They planted over 1 billion trees, 1 million trees here in Massachusetts. Over 100,000 young men participated in this in Massachusetts. But you can see how hard physical labor that was. Walking up the side of the hill with a heavy hoe and a bag full of young seedlings. Example of the discipline. Got to get up, got to go to breakfast, dressed out in the trucks by some particular time, and then the truck would roll off to the work site. One of the things, of course, young men had the opportunity to learn was how to drive a truck and how to maintain a truck. Check the oil, check the water, check the tires. Yeah, every morning, an important, very important function for a soldier in the transportation corps or something like that. You see the young men here, all dressed up in their uniforms, already go to work early some morning. That's no CC camp. It takes a lot of discipline to organize large groups of young men into effective teams. Large groups of unemployed young men in a town, a city, tend to get themselves into trouble. So this is one of FDR's concepts. He was going to protect the young men, protect the forest as well. But I think it's an interesting idea to protect young men by putting them to work. So another thing which isn't directly tied to military appropriation, but was the Dust Bowl. 1930. Notice it was right in the middle of the Great Depression. 1929 started the stock market crash. 1930, 1940, the Dust Bowl. Severe drought in the Southwest. All the cattle died. All the crops died. The farmers couldn't raise crops. They couldn't sell crops. They couldn't sell cattle. Had no income to pay their mortgages on their farms or on their farm equipment. Had to sell their farms cut rate because nobody wanted to buy the farms, right? So kind of a fire sale deal when they made the conclusion that it's time to head west to look for work in California. And when they arrived in California looking for work in better living conditions, Californians rejected them because there wasn't any work. And a lot of the Californians thought these guys are going to come here and become a burden on our welfare rolls here in California. This is the area of the Dust Bowl. The dust, high winds was another part of the problem. Drought plus high winds blew hundreds of millions of tons of dust, fine topsoil, all the way across the country. Greatest migration in U.S. history caused by the Dust Bowl. Of course, those people who migrated were homeless. Family loaded up on their way to west. So here's the migration routes, basically towards California, Oregon. It's a book I recommend by John Steinbeck called The Grapes of Wrath. It follows the lives of one family, tenant farmers forced to leave their farms by the Dust Bowl. As refugees, they faced hardship, exploitation, and injustice along the way. John Steinbeck really writes well. Now, the military situation. Adolf Hitler had been building his military for years after World War I. And America was way behind in men, tanks, and airplanes. You can see one of Hitler's formation of Nazi soldiers. These formations, these rallies were huge. Took advantage of radio eventually. Now, the Allies were unprepared for war. Why was that? Well, during the 1930s, the Nazi Party took over Germany and immediately began preparing for war with a secret rearmament effort. Secrecy put the Allies at disadvantage because we were unaware of it. We didn't know that we needed to counter it. Luftwaffe had developed under the guise of civil aviation is one bit of the secrecy. They're building airfields, right? Well, could be a civil airfield. Here's a mass production effort of Messerschmitt's German fighters. Where did they learn how to do this? Well, Henry Ford had truck plants. Remember, Henry Ford was the wizard of mass production with the Model T, and he was building trucks, mass producing them in Germany. And so the Germans, I can't say they adopted, because I don't know if they learned it from him, but they used it, the concept of mass production. And it's extremely important to have common parts. So when you have a damaged airplane, but maybe the propeller is still good, you can use it on another airplane. If they're all unique, if everyone's been uniquely designed, then you can't take parts off of one and use it to repair and get another one into the air. Interesting, during this period, the United States had produced 35 tanks. 35 tanks. All of them were unique. Didn't use mass production for a tank production. So by 1939, Germany had an operational air force of fighters and bombers, and they used combined arms tactics, where the fighters and the bombers worked together with the ground troops and the ground tank divisions and so forth. Very effective. Very effective. Because it caused the fighters and bombers could go beyond enemy lines and cause all kinds of chaos to the enemy's logistics train in their headquarter buildings and troops that were on trains and that sort of thing. So behind the lines, the fighters could raise havoc. But this mass production of airplanes was really a key. Now, another reason why we weren't ready for the war, why we weren't making great preparations, because isolation was really important in the United States during this time period. And one of the reasons was because the memories of the horrors of World War I were fresh. And here's one of the horrors: gas attacks. Another horror, of course, was living in trenches where it's cold and wet, having to go against machine guns, climbing over barbed wire, and of course the artillery bombardments would terrify you in the night. Another reason why we weren't ready and why we weren't getting ready, another reason why we had isolationism, was because some Americans believed that American bankers and arms manufacturers had pushed for involvement in World War I for profit. So the Marine Corps general wrote a book called War is a Racket. That people were profiteering, selling airplanes, tanks, machine guns. But it increased the popular suspicions that wartime profiteering was a fact, and that popular suspicion influenced public opinion toward being neutral. keep in mind that George Washington also said that. And then later, Eisenhower said the same thing. He said, beware the military industrial complex. A lot of folks thought that the trade relationships and the loans that we had made to our allies in World War I had in fact drawn us into World War I. So, reason for isolationism. Now, another reason for isolationism, of course, because war is expensive. So the economic conditions proved to be an important distractor from preparing for war. The Great Depression, tremendous number of people out of work, not a whole lot of excess money available to pay for an army, to pay for airplanes, pay for warships. Another reason, during this time period, people thought that we could use logic, we could have understandings, we could talk to each other, we didn't have to shoot each other. So, League of Nations, after World War I, was a pact asserting that the international community would protect its members, large and small, from aggression. But it had no army. At least NATO has an army, NATO has an air force, but League of Nations did not have an army. And when Ethiopia came under attack from the Italians, the only two countries, France and Britain, that could in fact do anything about this Italian aggression in Ethiopia. Italians were friends with the French, and France was trying to improve relationships with Italy. So France backed out of any attempt to stop the aggression in Ethiopia. Britain had some really fancy speeches about what they were going to do and sent some battleships down towards Ethiopia, but then decided that they didn't want to go it alone. So that was the end of the League of Nations. It turned out basically to be a scam. Now, the United States didn't join the League of Nations, but of course, one of the reasons maybe Britain said we don't want to be alone doing this, the United States did not join the League of Nations, so it became the gap in the bridge. This is an old cartoon, political cartoon. Now, another reason why we weren't prepared for World War II was our allies had other priorities. France had decided that the government was now the Popular Front. They had been elected. They came to power through the promise of social reforms. But social reforms cost a lot of money. And so they couldn't spare the money or the attention because they were focused on social reform. They couldn't spare the money or the attention to focus on building up the military. Great Britain, both the people and the government were eager for peace. Britain also felt a lot of affinity towards Germany after World War I. Thought that maybe Germany had gotten a bad deal after World War I. So they weren't eager to rearm. So obviously, economic depression is an important distractor from any focus on military development. Can't spend money, you don't have it. Lack of funding for the military meant another thing. Insufficient money for military intelligence. Lack of work. So this, of course, don't have military intelligence, you're not going to be aware of what Nazi Germany is doing in their military developments. And Germany was making an effort to keep a lot of their efforts, such as the tank battles they were taking, that were actually ran on Russian soil, so that the Allies wouldn't be aware of it. They kept the size of their battleships secret. They're much heavier than in accordance with the Navy the ship league agreements. So another reason why we didn't get ready in a timely way. The war crept up on Europe. Initially, Hitler took little small bites. His first victims were German-speaking regions. 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria. A lot of the Austrians weren't in favor of this. In fact, 70,000 of them were arrested. 1938, the next victim was Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was an area around Czechoslovakia of German-speaking people. And the loss now of Sudetenland was another problem, because around Czechoslovakia is where you have your defenses against an invasion by Germany, and that was the area that was lost. because that was Sudetenland. Sudetenland is where the defenses were. It's also where the German-speaking Czechoslovakians live. This is Austria down here to show you the other country. So when Sudetenland was annexed by Germany, the Czechoslovakia, that's the yellow country here, lost a lot of their protective defensive region. Hurt them later when Germany attacked them. Now, that's why we weren't ready. Now, after March 4 inauguration, his first inauguration of 3, the next day he declared a 4-day bank holiday to stop the bank panics, people taking all the money out. Very shortly thereafter, March 9, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, which included the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is still in effect today, still insures your deposits. So days later, FDR urged Americans to put their money back in the bank. By the end of the month, 3/4 of the banks had reopened. The government also shut down banks that were not viable. They weren't going to be able to come for bad practices. Then, I mentioned the Civilian Conservation Corps again. And then in 39, remember it was 38 Austria, 38 Sudetenland. Hitler promised it would be his last chunk, his last bite in Northern Europe, and then here was 39. Hitler invaded. So what did FDR do to get us prepared for war? He moved quickly, of course. So in 1940, second inauguration, second cabinet, he made a move to make Congress bipartisan by selecting some interventionists, Republicans, for his cabinet. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, an experienced diplomat, and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. Now, these guys were interventionists. They were known to be interventionists, and they wanted to extend every sort of help to Great Britain, as did FDR, short of war. But this was a brilliant move. Of course, the guys were very capable. But they were also recognized to be interventionists, and they were also recognized to be strong Republicans. Stimson, notice his credentials: Secretary of War under President Taft, who was a Republican; Secretary of State, President Hoover, Republican; and then Secretary of War, and now under Democrats, Roosevelt until he died, and then President Trump. Very, very capable man. Frank Knox, at one time, Republican candidate for Vice President of the United States under Alf Landon as President candidate. But he was a veteran, served in the Rough Riders. And then later, after the Spanish-American War, he served in World War I as an artillery officer in France, so he had good military credentials. And he was also a known advocate, and also a Republican, known advocate for military preparedness. During World War II, Knox supported aid to the Allies and opposed isolationism. He was a known non-New Dealer. So people couldn't say, you're just going to fold up and you're going to do everything that Roosevelt wants, but he was a known New Dealer, and he made it clear he was not a New Dealer. So, but he did his job as Secretary of the Navy. Now, when did that happen? After the defeat of France by Germany, Knox became FDR's Secretary of the Navy and made some rather dramatic changes in the leadership of the Navy. Got rid of the admiral who was in charge of Pearl Harbor, for example. Now, here's the political cartoon that shows the reaction of the other Republicans from the appointment to FDR's cabinet of Knox. He's got seen as a Navy sailor uniform, and then Stimson over here on the right. And all the Republicans are booing this because they thought it was a dirty trick to have a bipartisan cabinet. So, but no, on the left-hand side, I have the original painting, so you should see that basically how the cartoonist used the original painting to mock up this cartoon. But the booing of the Republicans, they thought this was a blatant dirty trick on the part of FDR to have, even though they were really capable guys, but to choose interventionist Republicans for his cabinet got boos. Now, number two here, what did FDR do to get us prepared for war? Basically, he worked it through Congress to give 50 US destroyers. These are old destroyers, World War I destroyers, 1918 type destroyers, exchanged for land rights on British possessions. Such things as a Navy base in Bermuda and Air Force base in Bermuda, which later became Naval Air Station Bermuda. I used to fly patrols out of there because these leases were for 99 years. So it's now closed, unfortunately. So, destroyers for bases. 4 Pipers, you can see the 4 smokestacks. That's what they're called, 4 Pipers, 4 stackers. World War I built destroyers, 99-year leases. And this was a psychological uplift for the British. 1940, Britain's under attack, but now we're going to help them defend the convoys of our ships that we're going to feed them, to arm them in Great Britain. And we spent a big pile of money here, Charlestown Naval Yard, building these up, renovating them. So keep that in mind. Helped our Navy yards in Boston, Charlestown, big time, because now they had lots of work. So another concept was Lend-Lease. Great Britain said, we don't have any money. We don't have any money to buy airplanes, ships, munitions from you. So it was against the law, one of the neutrality acts, to actually loan belligerents money. It was against the law, one of the neutrality acts, to give them munitions, ships. Because the concern was, of course, this would get us into the war. So, but we won't give them to you, we'll lend them to you. So how did that work? Now, Winston Churchill had suggested in a speech that Britain had the tools, Britain could finish the job. And this implied that the US would not need to provide ground troops because Britain would do the fighting for us. All they needed was basically the tools to do the job. So, and it was really a short speech, and I think very effective. But FDR then later used the same idea. If we aid our allies, they'll do the fighting for us. We'll keep the United States, us, our children, our grandchildren, out of this unpleasant war. So that was kind of the argument for Lend-Lease. Now, I think the speech is short, it's really effective. It's called the fire hose analogy that FDR used in one of his fireside chats. And these fireside chats were really friendly, really clear. 500 US radio stations tuned into this, the largest radio audience ever in the history of the world. 132 million people in the United States, 90 million people tuned into this, as did Winston Churchill, translated into 6 languages in Europe. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he could take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. I don't say to him before that operation, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me 15 for it. I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. Of course, he also implied, if you put out your fire, maybe your fire won't spread to my house. So, simple, clear metaphor. So, in 1940, FDR proposed Lend-Lease. 1941, in that speech, FDR called the US to be the great arsenal, but Great Britain had no money, so US leased military supplies to the Allies. The act allowed the US to send war supplies to any nation considered to be vital to the defense of the United States. So, not vital to the defense of Great Britain, vital defense of the United States. And we can ship the materials now on armed US ships. The wording here is really important. Defense of the United States, not defense of Great Britain. Later, of course, after Germany attacked Russia, we could then send Lend-Lease to Russia to help them fight the Nazis. So, rehash a little bit. Churchill said we can't pay. FDR uses the fire hose analogy. FDR uses arsenal of democracy. And then you had a couple of congressmen who said that we could maybe stay out of the war and make piles of money if we provision our allies. Now, note the similarity to here to the Ukraine for the need for munitions, and maybe the idea that we supported Ukraine, maybe we could stay out of the war. Maybe NATO could stay out of the war. So, 41 Treasury Departments drafts Lend-Lease bill. Later, very shortly later, Congress began hearings on the Lend-Lease bill, and then Churchill gave us the Toole speech on London radio. They're all coordinated. Okay. Now, Lend-Lease funds were used here in the United States, right? To make ships, to build up our shipyards, to build aircraft factories, to build tank and truck plants. So the money was spent here, which employed large numbers of Americans. And an act to promote the defense of the United States. That's what the Lend-Lease Act was as a subtitle. Defense of the United States. Over here on the right, you see the British flag, and you see the Republic of China flag. That's America is going to support them. Okay. Now, remember that we didn't basically declare war on Germany or Japan or Italy until December of 41. Here, Willow Grove Ford B-24 plant began production in 1940. They were the largest one-story building in the world at the time, the B-24 plant. They actually began completed 4-engine long-range heavy load bombers in the summer of 41. We were still neutral at the time. Keep that in mind. Ford had promised FDR that he would put out a B-24 out of his plant, one every hour, 24 hours a day. And he met that goal. Can you imagine? A completed bomber. And of course, each one took several weeks to put together, but they were pumping one out 7 days a week. An incredible effort. And there's a great book on this. It's called The Arsenal of Democracy. And I recommend you read it. It's about this plant and how Ford developed it. And of course, he had huge housing problems and then transportation problems for his workers and so forth. He hired everybody. Blind people, deaf people, people with one hand, all races. Just he put them to work. Now, you can understand this too. This is, of course, an American political cartoon, but the idea here is this is the Nazi. He's saying what was obvious to everybody, I think, that Lend-Lease, you're giving the enemy munitions and guns. The only thing you're not giving them is people. So it effectively was the end of neutrality. Loading a tank. Some of the Lend-Lease Jeeps made their way all the way over to Burma Road. They had to be carried piece by piece over for assembly in Burma. Russia became eligible, and you can see Great Britain, 31 billion, Soviet Union, 11 billion, France. Of course, they were by now, the government of France was now in England. So was the government in exile. They still got $3 billion worth of gear ready for the invasion of France. Charlestown Navy Yard, here's construction of 2 destroyers using Lend-Lease funds. The Boston Navy Yard, including the Charlestown Navy Yard, really blossomed during this time period. Here's the dry dock with a battleship. It's an Iowa class battleship, which is, the Missouri and the New Jersey and the Wisconsin and the Missouri. That's that class. And then an aircraft carrier. I haven't been able to find any aircraft carrier, as I tried to figure this out. Which aircraft carrier is this? Which one was built in the Boston Navy Yard? I haven't been able to figure that out. May have just come in for repair. But blossomed, huge employment. Now, what else did FDR do to get us prepared for the war? Well, he was able to get the idea of conscription, the draft, the first U.S. peacetime conscription. Keep in mind, we're still neutral. So this is Selective Training and Service Act 1940. At the beginning, it was all men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register with selective service and be placed in order for call to military service. Later, that was changed. All men between the ages of 18 and 64 were to register to be placed in order for call to military service. I guess there were some specialties, or perhaps if you were 64, if you were an orthopedic surgeon or something like that, maybe but anyway, 18 to 64 later. But the selective service system was now in place. So after Pearl Harbor, there was a huge surge of enlistments, but the selective service system was in place to examine these guys and take in their enlistments and put them in the right place where they belong in accordance with their skills and education and physical fitness and all that sort of thing. So good thing the selective service system was in place in advance. Another thing FDR did to get us prepared for war, they had these fireside chats. They were brilliant. They attracted a huge audience because people believed in FDR, believed what he said. They believed that he was their leader and that they wanted to follow him. They wanted to hear what he had to say. Anyway, so now this is the situation. All the red is Nazi-held territory. In early 1941, England was all alone. And then starting in September 40, London was bombed 57 consecutive nights during the Blitz. London. United States, as you know, didn't declare war against Germany until more than a year later. So was FDR effective in getting our plants going? I think he was. But in 39, the total U.S. aircraft production for the military was 3,000 planes. But were they combat planes? Were they bombers? Were they transports? But the U.S. Army Air Corps had 1,700 planes total. Many of them obsolete. However, in January, Congress authorized another 3,251 aircraft. Already, from the cash and carry, the demand for aircraft had already gotten our aircraft industry up and going. So they were already going. Now, that was a glut of orders now. Well, you can see over here on the right-hand side, you see the German aircraft production. In 1939, another 4,733 combat airplanes were going to come off the German assembly lines. And here, in 1939, we only authorized the procurement of 3,251 aircraft. So we were way, way, way behind. However, ramped up really quickly. You can see here, the planes total in 1940, planes total including airliners, 6,000 at the very bottom over here on the left-hand side. And then on the, over here on the right-hand side, the peak, 1944, 96,318 airplanes a year. And that just boggles the mind. But you can see how American industry ramped up rapidly. Ships. Tremendous number of ships. 94,179 ships. Lots of landing ships. The landing ships are in the orange streak that goes up and down. There's a real demand for landing ships, as you can imagine, because they were needed in every theater to move goods from ship to shore. But the U.S. industry really turned to, gave up building automobiles. Bam, no more automobiles. You couldn't buy a domestic automobile. Couldn't buy a refrigerator. And there was no, and you had gasoline rationing as well, but they turned quickly from producing domestic automobiles to producing military vehicles. Now, FDR's efforts were successful because Americans listened to him and had faith in him. He moved quickly and he solved massive problems in new ways like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Domestic auto production had stopped, saving steel. And so workers went to building other things, tanks, trucks. Nylon stockings were hard to find because they used the nylon for parachutes. And pennies were made of steel. Well, how come? Needed the copper for wiring. So you can see dramatic, sudden, quick application of U.S. industry to the war effort. So the world's democracies slept while Hitler rearmed and began his world conquest, and that's what he was after. He was after world conquest. He took little bites at first. Austria and Sudetenland, both German-speaking parts of the world. But the Munich Agreement, which was signed by Germany, United Kingdom, France, and Fascist Italy in March 30, 1938, provided for the annexation by Nazi Germany of Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Notice the Czechs weren't on at the table during that Munich Agreement. Hitler said it would be his last territorial claim in Northern Europe. However, he invaded Poland September the next year, 39. And then Denmark, Belgium, Holland, France, Norway. So today, the Munich Agreement has become a synonym for the futility of appeasing an expansionist totalitarian state. If the world does not react to the unprovoked aggression of Russia toward the Ukraine, then we can expect Russia to continue bite by bite, European country by European country. Any questions?
No.
That's how you do finalize.
So normally at this point, we invite questions from the audience, but earlier in the program, we had trouble bringing in our Bedford vets. They are now online. So we're just going to ask your indulgence while we do a quick announcement. Can you bring up that slide for us? This won't take a minute. Okay. So as you know, our fellow veterans at the Bedford VA Hospital join us by Zoom for most of our programs. And Andrea Vinci is the recreational therapist who makes it possible for the veterans in the units that she serves for Charlie and Delta to gather on our meeting days and share these programs by Zoom. And they're here today. Welcome, welcome veterans. And today, we just want to take a moment to recognize and thank Andrea for going above and beyond to bring our fellow veterans into our family here. Andrea, you and your veterans have made us a better, stronger organization. And so for all you have done, Andrea, for the veterans in your care, and for making our partnership an enduring one, the Lexington veterans present you with this small token of our thanks. We will be in touch to arrange a time to deliver this certificate, to say thank you in person, and to celebrate properly. Let's give Andrea a virtual hand. Come on back up, Bob. So Andrea, we send you our love and our thanks, and to all our veterans, thanks again for joining us. I hope you have some good questions for Bob. All right, now Bob is usually my assistant with the Q&A.
What I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you a story first, if you don't mind, okay? The story my grandfather told me about the Great Depression. He was a house painter, indoors and outdoors, and he had a good friend named Charlie. Charlie owned a factory that made meat pies, chicken pot pies, and rabbit pot pies. Well, my grandfather worked for Charlie occasionally, and he also knew how much rabbit meat costs. And he looked at the price that Charlie was charging for his rabbit pot pies, and he couldn't figure out how Charlie was making and selling a rabbit pot pie for as cheaply as he was. So he said, Charlie, can you explain this to me? Rabbit meat's expensive and your rabbit pot pies are cheap. Well, Charlie said, I dilute the rabbit meat with a little bit of horse meat. And of course, my grandfather was appalled, right? He said, oh, Charlie, come on, come on. How much rabbit meat? Well, 50-50. One rabbit, one horse.
Wait a minute, hang on, Phil. Take the.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. You mentioned how during the crash, the banks were insured and put back. The currency was devalued. And my question is, with eyes towards today, how much was the dollar devalued?
The number 30% comes to mind.
Oh,
Now, one of the factors, it was the fact that we were on the gold standard. And FDR took us off the gold standard. In those days, you could actually take your dollar, your paper money to the bank and get gold for it. That caused people to go to the bank and take their gold home, and depleted the gold reserves, because the gold reserves were the foundation of the paper money. It's no longer the case. We're no longer no longer based on gold anymore.
You brought out the idea of isolationism and how powerful it was very well. Isolation was a nip and tuck idea. There was no great enthusiasm for changing a lot of these laws. In Congress in 1940, the Selective Service Act, which was supposed to get us going and establish the draft. The parties were very evenly divided, and in 1940, the Selective Service Act passed by one vote in the House of Representatives.
That's interesting, thank you.
I represent the French voice in the audience, so I have studied that period of history and just wanted to remind you of a couple of facts. Is that, and you know you are aware of that, World War I was fought mainly on French land. France lost a generation of men during that war. France, in addition, fought that war from 1914 to 1918, not for 1 year like the Americans. And that explained a lot of the reluctance to get involved with another war, because if you remember, World War I was the war to end all wars.
Yeah.
So I have read a lot of stuff, and a number of folks in my family have actually left their life and are buried somewhere around Verdun. And another thing I wanted to point out is you gave a great presentation on the American point of view. I spent some time recently in Boston to see the Auschwitz exhibit. It's absolutely awesome because it presents the point of view how Germany got involved with Nazism. And it talks about the unfair Treaty of Versailles that was imposed on Germany at the end of World War I. If you have the time, I suggest you go visit that, because in view of everything that's happening right now, it's really enlightening.
Thank you.
Right.
I'd like to know. My understanding is that Sweden continued to sell Swedish steel to Germany. That Germany didn't need to invade to get the Swedish steel. So it was, Germany was getting what they wanted, so they didn't need to send troops in there. That's my understanding.
One other comment, I knew a lot about what happened during the Depression and all the different bills all the different bills that were passed during the Depression, and I knew a lot about them. But when you showed about the CCC, it's hard to imagine anything like that happening nowadays, that these people all got in line and did what the Army told them, or that the Army was even allowed to train young Americans to, come in.
It was considered to be really a good deal, though.
Yeah.
They got double the pay of an Army private,
Right.
and they got good food, and there was only 200 men in a camp. But like that one song, having a mess kit is really great when you don't have a dime in your pocket, So when you're really hungry and haven't eaten a good meal in who knows how long, then suddenly 3 squares a day, all you can eat.
And the camp went surrounded by protesters who didn't like what they did.
Yeah, no protesters.
Okay, Bob, you shared with me at lunch a little bit about Lindbergh and the isolationist America First group. Would you share that with us now? Because it was my understanding that during the 30s, Lindbergh, who had become a hero in our eyes, was enamored by Germany and was over there and treated like royalty. So he came back and was the vocal point of the isolationist group. But you made some other comments that don't cast it in quite that extreme light.
So, some people accuse him of being a Nazi, but I found nothing in his diaries or anything that says that he was in fact a Nazi. It does look like he was anti-Semitic, and he was for not supporting our allies militarily, and he was for not building up our US military. He was an isolationist. He had been in the Army Air Corps and had advanced to the rank of colonel, but after this, basically FDR wouldn't let him be in the Army Air Corps anymore. Remember, that was the predecessor to the US Air Force. And so he was no longer in a uniform, but he went to the Pacific, and strangely enough, he flew 50 combat missions as a civilian consultant with the US Marine Corps. And my uncle was there flying for the Marines, and he said that Lindbergh had an aircraft parts company in California that was trying to bring in bomb racks for Corsairs. Remember, the Corsair was the Navy airplane with a gull wing, and it was a fighter, so it wasn't designed for bombs originally. So they needed bomb racks. So Lindbergh was there to introduce his bomb racks, and it's helped install them, and then on the Corsairs, and then fly Corsairs as bombers against the Japanese. And he flew 50 missions. And after the war, Eisenhower promoted him to a general in the Air Force, in reserves. So as soon as we declared war on Germany, Lindbergh changed and became an advocate of military preparation. So I think maybe he just was afraid we were going to get into the war and we were going to get really hammered. It'd be a disaster for us as we were unprepared, and Germany was well prepared. So maybe it was just fearful that that's what would happen. We'd get squashed by Nazi Germany. As Poland had, France had the most powerful navy in Europe. Excuse me, most powerful army in Europe, and they only lasted 5 weeks under attack by the Nazi Germany.
Bob, thanks for a great talk. The Lend-Lease Act, I'm curious, given that it was pretty clear what that was really intended to do, did it have much trouble passing Congress?
Yeah, very controversial. Very controversial, because people saw what it was. It's just basically to get around the Neutrality Act and get around the law against loaning money or making loans to belligerents. So it was very controversial and had trouble getting through Congress.
Just a comment. Enjoyed it very much. I happened to spend most of my career with Rockwell International. And one of the businesses I was associated with was the Hine Bearing Company in Fairfield, Connecticut. And Hine originated probably like a lot of companies as a result of the war. When the German Messerschmitt went up against an American fighter, the American fighter, they always lost. The Messerschmitt was like a bumblebee in the sky. And one was fortunately shot down in London. It was very well preserved. And Allied engineers came from everywhere to go through it. And one of those engineers was this guy, Charlie Hine, who lived in Fairfield, Connecticut. And he saw that there was this rod-end bearing that enabled it to have the maneuverability of a bumblebee, unlike what the Americans were using at that point, which was just one way or the other. And yeah, a lot of good things came out of it.
Yeah, good technology for sure.
No idea. Let me ask a quick question about Cabinet Secretary Frank Knox. I just learned he was an artillery officer in World War I.
Right, in France.
Now, by any
Oh,
chance,
was that Stimson? Stimson, I think, was the artillery officer. I could have that wrong.
anyway, could Mr. Knox be a descendant of Henry Knox?
That could be, I do
I
not
was just
know.
thinking, wouldn't that be, I'd like to find that out, particularly if there was an artillery connection. Anyway, all right, that was my question. So, other questions, comments? We love comments. We love contributions. We love anecdotes. Marion?
Just wanted to comment that my father was drafted. At the time, he was 36 years old and he had 4 children. And by the time he appeared for his physical, they had changed the age and he didn't have to serve. Now, I don't know what year that was, but he didn't have to serve. And he was a pharmacist, but he went to work for the Colt Manufacturing Company in New Haven. And that was his contribution to the war.
Yeah, the draft, same with Vietnam, it changed. Every couple of months, it seemed to change, the selective service. Who's gonna be drafted? And of course, if you had some particular skill they needed, like if you were an orthopedic surgeon, you might be well above the average age, and they needed you, so you get drafted.
But I don't know if the age changed. I mean, he was an older man anyway. When I was born, he was 32. So, and I had 3 siblings after me. So he had 4 children, and this was more toward the end of the war. But they changed the age so that he didn't have to go. So that was it.
Yeah, they changed some, originally, Vietnam, if you were married, that gave you a slight deferral. In college, that gave you a deferral. If you were married and had a kid, that gave you another deferral. Yeah, so they changed it.
But I would have thought, that as a pharmacist, he might have been valuable to the.
Yes, they had enough pharmacists, right?
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I'm sure he was in a special category. Just, yeah.
Roger.
I have a historical note.
I just want to kind of confirm what you're saying about the draft and the early 40s and the expansion of the draft. You told me something I never knew, is that my dad was 35 years old with 5 kids in 1941. And he had graduated from engineering school in 26, and never had a job as an engineer. He couldn't get one for a long period of time. And then in 1940, he got a job with Stone Webster as an electrical engineer, and never was in the draft. Was active in the draft. And then in 1946, after working 6 years for Stone Webster, he was awarded a citation from the Secretary of War at that time for participating in the Oak Ridge project. He never knew. I'm sure there's a lot of other people like that that were, as you said, able to not avoid the draft, but were drafted in a way as a specialist and participated in the war.
Yeah, my dad was the same thing. He didn't know what he was working on.
Wow.
He didn't know. He didn't know what it was he was building.
Time for a couple more questions, sir?
Really a quick historical note. Prior to
Close to you.
World War I, the British royal family spoke German.
Yeah,
And they adopted a name Windsor at that time. So their background was German.
Yeah, interesting, yeah.
Any final words? We love family lore. Any family tidbits are welcome. Okay, Elizabeth, you're gonna wrap it up.
I have a last quick comment. My father's family was in Alsace, and as some of you might know, it's dangerously close to Germany. They were annexed during World War II. And my dad, who was a young man in 1930s, told me that he would go to Germany across the border and he would buy a fountain pen for $5 million. We're talking about inflation. That's real inflation. And if you go to that Auschwitz exhibit, and I have no relation, so I'm not advertising for that, but they have large banknotes for $50, $20 million too, so you could buy your bread and stuff with it.
Yeah.
It was horrible. The reason Hitler, Marx, I'm sorry. Yes, Deutschmarks, Reichsmark. And, well, to buy your bread, you needed, he told me you needed a wheelbarrow full of money. To
Yeah,
buy
that's what I
some
heard.
bread.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, and they even took the Reichsmarks and overstamped them. You know, might start at 20, and then you'd see that this one was stamped later, you know, 20,000 or something like that. Yeah, with a rubber stamp.
well, please join me and give a warm round of applause to Bob Lewis. Another fine job. Thank you, Bob. I'm sure he'll have another wonderful program for us next season. This concludes our presentation. We will see you on Monday, June 10. I hope to see you at Depot Square, Memorial Day, 2 weeks from today. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon.